The weight, 68 tons. The armor, impenetrable to every Allied tank gun at combat range. The problem, it couldn't cross the bridge. December 1944. A Kampfgruppe commander stands in ankle-deep mud watching his most powerful weapon sink into Belgian road surface like a stone through water. Behind him, an entire offensive timetable collapses. Ahead of him, a bridge rated for 35 tons. In his radio, furious demands from commanders who planned an attack around a weapon that can't reach the battlefield. The Tiger II. The Allies called it the King Tiger. Germany called it the Answer. History would call it something else entirely, the most powerful tank that helped lose the war. This is the story of 492 tanks that were supposed to change everything. But it's really about the moment military excellence became military liability, when engineering perfection became strategic failure, when the desire to build the best blinded an entire nation to the necessity of building the adequate. And what it reveals about the fatal gap between what sounds impressive in a conference room and what actually works when your army needs to move. To understand what went wrong, you need to understand what Germany believed was going right. By 1943, German tank doctrine had evolved into something approaching religious conviction. Bigger is better, thicker is safer, more powerful is more effective. This wasn't stupidity. It was the logical conclusion drawn from years of combat data. Thicker armor meant fewer losses. Bigger guns meant killing enemies before they killed you. The Tiger I had proven this calculus worked. It was nearly invincible in direct combat, feared across every front, a weapon that changed the tactical equation wherever it appeared. So when Hitler demanded an even better Tiger, the engineers at Henschel did what engineers do when given unlimited ambition and limited reality checks. They built a masterpiece. The Tiger II emerged from German design studios like a fever dream of invincibility-made steel, armor up to 180 millimeters thick on the turret front. The legendary 88mm KWK-43 gun that could punch through any Allied armor at ranges beyond retaliation. Sloped armor borrowed from the Panther, eliminating the Tiger I's vulnerable flat surfaces. In terms of pure fighting power, pure one-on-one lethality, nothing the Allies fielded could match it. A Sherman tank facing a King Tiger wasn't in a fight. It was in an execution, where the only variables were how quickly the crew could bail out and how many rounds the Tiger needed to finish them. On paper, in technical specifications, in carefully controlled firing range tests, the Tiger II was exactly what Germany needed. 68 tons of Krupp steel that made every Allied tanker's blood run cold. The propaganda photographs showed a weapon of such obvious power that its very existence seemed to justify the resources consumed in its creation. But wars are not fought on paper. They are not won on firing ranges. And the Tiger II was about to teach Germany an expensive lesson about the difference between tactical perfection and strategic catastrophe. The problems began before the first Tiger II even reached the front. Production, which was supposed to be streamlined, became a nightmare of complexity. Every Tiger II required 300,000 man-hours to build. For context, Germany could produce 5 Panzerfouls, the workhorse medium tank, for the same investment. The precision machining needed for that massive gun, the specialized armor plate, the intricate transmission designed to move 68 tons, all of this required skilled labor that Germany was hemorrhaging to casualties and strategic bombing. Henschel factories, operating under Allied air raids, struggling with material shortages, managed to produce about 50 tanks per month at peak efficiency. America was building 1,500 Shermans in the same time period. But the production bottleneck was just the opening act. The real crisis began when someone asked a question that should have been asked much earlier. How do we get these tanks to the battlefield? Germany's rail network, the logistical backbone of military movement, was designed around weight limits established decades earlier. The Tiger II exceeded those limits catastrophically. Standard rail cars couldn't carry it. Reinforced flat cars had to be specially manufactured, diverted from other critical uses. Rail bridges along the routes to the eastern and western fronts required engineering surveys before a King Tiger could cross. Some bridges simply couldn't handle the weight, forcing massive detours that consumed fuel and time. Moving a Tiger II battalion by rail wasn't logistics. It was a special engineering project requiring advanced planning, route surveys, and infrastructure reinforcement, and that assumed the rails were even functioning. By 1944, Allied air power had turned Germany's rail network into a constantly degrading system of emergency repairs and improvised routes. Sending a King Tiger to the front meant gambling that the rail line would remain intact for the 72 hours the journey required, that the rail car wouldn't be strafed by Allied fighters, that the destination yard would still exist when the tank arrived. Each Tiger II shipped east or west represented not just the value of the tank itself, but the opportunity cost of the rail capacity it consumed, capacity that could have moved 20 tons of ammunition, or evacuated 200 wounded, or transported the fuel that other units desperately needed. Then came the roads. Or more accurately, the catastrophic discovery that most roads were not roads in any meaningful sense to a 68-ton tank. Engineers rate road surfaces by load-bearing capacity, the maximum weight per axle that pavement or packed earth can support, before structural failure. The Tiger II, with its weight distributed across relatively narrow tracks, exceeded the load rating of virtually every road in France, Belgium, and Poland. What this meant in practice was brutal and immediate. King Tigers moving to the front didn't drive on roads so much as destroy them, their tracks ripping through pavement, grinding road surfaces into rubble, creating troughs of mud and broken stone that made the route impassable for every vehicle that followed. Commanders learned through bitter experience that you couldn't integrate King Tigers into normal mechanized columns. They required separate routes, advanced engineering reconnaissance, sometimes even road reinforcement. In the fluid, fast-moving battles of 1944 and 1945, this made them liabilities. While Panzer IV and Panther battalions could relocate quickly to respond to breakthroughs or reinforce threatened sectors, Tiger II units moved at the speed of civil engineering projects. By the time a King Tiger battalion reached a crisis point, the crisis had usually evolved into something different, somewhere else. Bridges presented an even more existential problem. Germany's bridge infrastructure, like its roads, was built for a pre-King Tiger world. Weight limits of 35 to 40 tons were standard for military bridges, adequate for every tank in service when they were constructed. The Tiger II, at 68 tons, couldn't use them at all. Engineers developed workarounds, none of them good. Specialized bridging equipment could be brought up if it was available, if there was time, if the enemy wasn't shelling the crossing site. Some bridges could be reinforced with emergency timber supports, a process that took hours and advertised your intentions to any enemy with reconnaissance aircraft. Often the only option was finding a ford, a river crossing shallow enough for the Tiger to wade through, assuming the riverbed was solid enough to support the weight, assuming the depth didn't flood the engine compartment, assuming enemy guns weren't already registered on the obvious crossing point. The Ardennes offensive in December 1944 turned these theoretical problems into operational catastrophe. The German plan depended on speed, on mechanized columns punching through American lines and racing for the Meuse River before Allied reserves could respond. Several Kampfgruppen included King Tiger battalions, the spearhead that would smash through resistance and lead the breakthrough. What happened instead was a master class in how tactical superiority becomes strategic paralysis. King Tigers assigned to lead the advance found themselves trapped behind their own logistics. The narrow Ardennes roads, winding through hills and forests, were barely adequate for normal traffic. Under 68 tons of German steel, they disintegrated. Tanks that were supposed to be leading the charge instead sat immobilized, waiting for engineers to reinforce bridges, waiting for alternate routes to be scouted, waiting for the lighter tanks and half-tracks behind them to push forward and do the job the King Tigers were too heavy to perform. In several documented cases, entire offensives stalled because a single King Tiger had become stuck, blocking the only usable road, requiring hours of recovery operations while American defenders reinforced positions that should have been overrun in the first hours of the attack. But here's where the story shifts from logistics nightmare to something psychologically darker, because the men in those tanks knew, the commanders knew, the engineers knew, at some level perhaps not articulated in official reports, but understood in the exhausted silence of soldiers who had watched the same problems repeat across months and years. They knew they were operating weapons that had become counterproductive. Imagine being a King Tiger commander. You sit in the most powerful tank ever built. Your gun can kill any enemy before they get close enough to threaten you. Your armor is proof against anything they can shoot back. In direct combat, you are a god. But you also know that your tank consumes fuel at twice the rate of other panzers in conditions where fuel convoys are being strafed into burning wreckage every day. You know that if your transmission fails, a common problem given the strain of moving 68 tons, recovery is a multi-day engineering operation requiring specialized equipment that probably doesn't exist anymore. You know that the bridge ahead probably can't support you, that the road behind you is now destroyed, that your supply trucks can't follow because you've torn the route apart, that your battalion burns through its ammunition faster than the logistics system can resupply it. You know, in other words, that you are tactically supreme and strategically useless. This creates a psychological weight that no amount of armor can protect against. You've been given the best weapon Germany can build, and discovered that best doesn't mean effective, that your superiority in combat is matched by your inferiority in everything combat depends on. You're simultaneously the tip of the spear and the anchor drowning the assault. This wasn't theoretical guilt or philosophical doubt. This was concrete, actionable knowledge creating impossible situations. After-action reports from late 1944 and 1945 read like exercises in controlled despair. Commanders describing King Tigers abandoned not because they were destroyed, but because they ran out of fuel 3 kilometers from supply depots they couldn't reach. Technical officers reporting mechanical breakdowns that would normally take days to repair being resolved with demolition charges because recovery was impossible. Crews rolling past their own previous tanks, scuttled weeks earlier, metal tombstones marking the route of an advance that had stalled not from enemy action, but from self-generated immobility. The Eastern Front made everything worse. If Western European roads were inadequate, Russian roads were geological suggestions. The spring Rasputitsa, the seasonal mud that turned the steppe into an ocean of liquid earth, swallowed King Tigers like prehistoric tar pits. German engineers calculated that a Tiger II in mud conditions required 3 times its own weight in recovery vehicles to extract, assuming recovery vehicles could reach it without becoming stuck themselves. Soviet forces learned to simply bypass immobilized King Tigers, leaving them to sink slowly into the landscape while the Red Army continued its advance around them. In some sectors, King Tigers became fixed fortifications by default, positioned in villages or defensive points because moving them again was impossible. But it's the fuel consumption that reveals the deepest level of strategic dysfunction. The Maybach HL-230 engine, powerful enough to move 68 tons, but only barely, consumed fuel at catastrophic rates. At optimal cruising speed, the Tiger II managed about 100 liters per 100 kilometers. In combat conditions, with constant acceleration, deceleration, and the engine straining against the vehicle's mass, consumption could double. For context, a Panzer IV used a third of that fuel to cover the same distance. In 1944 and 1945, as Allied bombing systematically destroyed German synthetic fuel production and Soviet advances captured the Romanian oil fields, fuel became more valuable than ammunition. Commanders faced choices that would have seemed absurd in 1941: preserve your King Tigers by keeping them immobile, or commit them to battle, knowing each attack consumes fuel reserves you cannot replace. The mathematics of this failure are staggering. Germany produced 492 King Tigers at enormous cost in resources, labor, and industrial capacity. For the same investment, they could have built approximately 2,500 Panzerviehs or 1,500 Panthers. Both of those tanks were more than adequate to fight Shermans and T-34s, the Allied workhorses. Both could use existing infrastructure without modification. Both consumed half the fuel and required a fraction of the maintenance. Both could be produced quickly enough to replace losses, the critical factor in a war of attrition Germany was losing. The counter-argument made then, and sometimes still made now, focuses on the Tiger II's combat record. In direct engagement, King Tigers were devastatingly effective. Allied after-action reports describe encounters where single Tiger IIs held off entire tank companies, destroyed multiple Shermans or Cromwells before they could get within effective firing range, created psychological effects that disrupted attacks even when they weren't present. Some crews achieved kill ratios that sound fictional, 10-to-1 or higher. These weren't lies or propaganda. In the specific circumstance of tanks shooting at each other, the King Tiger was exactly as lethal as its designers promised. But this argument reveals exactly the pathology that created the problem. It treats tanks as dual weapons, as if warfare is a series of isolated combats where the better tank wins. This was the comfortable lie that allowed the King Tiger program to continue even as evidence of its strategic failure accumulated. Officers could point to battle reports showing Tigers dominating engagements and claim vindication. They weren't wrong about the combat effectiveness. They were wrong about what combat effectiveness meant in the context of losing a war. Because while that King Tiger was destroying 3 Shermans, 5 more Shermans were bypassing it on better roads. While it was waiting for fuel, Allied tanks were maintaining operational tempo. While it was being transported to a crisis point, the crisis had moved. While it consumed resources that could have sustained an entire Panzer battalion, that battalion was being destroyed piecemeal by an enemy who understood that wars are won by the adequate many, not the excellent few. This is where we need to slow down and understand something about organizational psychology and institutional self-deception. The King Tiger wasn't the product of stupidity. Everyone involved, from Hitler to the design engineers to the field commanders, was trying to solve a real problem. Germany was outnumbered, outproduced, and running out of time. Building tanks that could win individual battles decisively seemed like a rational response. If you can't build more tanks than the enemy, build better tanks. If you're fighting multiple opponents, make each of your vehicles count for 3 or 4 of theirs. The logic was seductive because it was partially true. Better equipment does provide advantages. Superior armor does save lives. More powerful guns do win engagements. The Tiger. I had proven all of this. The failure wasn't in the reasoning, but in its application at scale, in the unwillingness to acknowledge that advantages in one dimension create vulnerabilities in others. That you cannot engineer your way out of strategic resource deficits by building smaller numbers of bigger weapons. But here's the deeper pathology. The institutions producing the King Tiger had no incentive to acknowledge these problems. Henschel had a contract and a production line. The procurement officers had met their specifications. The field testing, done on controlled ranges with adequate fuel and maintenance support, showed the tank performing exactly as designed. The propaganda apparatus needed victory stories, and King Tigers destroying multiple Allied tanks provided them. Each part of the system was functioning correctly according to its local metrics. The dysfunction was systemic, visible only when you stepped back and asked whether the overall output, the net effect of all this effort and resource consumption, was actually helping Germany win the war. The answer was no. Objectively, measurably, no. Every King Tiger represented resources that could have produced weapons Germany actually needed: assault guns for infantry support, tank destroyers that were cheaper and nearly as effective, self-propelled artillery, or simply more fuel and ammunition for existing units. Every hour of skilled labor spent on King Tiger production was an hour not spent repairing damaged Panthers or building the trucks that mechanized infantry desperately needed. Every rail car dedicated to moving King Tigers was a rail car not moving food to cities or evacuating wounded from field hospitals. But acknowledging this required admitting that the entire conceptual framework, the belief system that prioritized individual vehicle superiority over operational effectiveness, was wrong. It required high-ranking officers telling Hitler that his demand for wonder weapons was counterproductive. It required engineers admitting that their masterpiece was a mistake. It required a level of institutional honesty that very few organizations achieve, even in peacetime, much less in the middle of losing an existential war. So the King Tigers kept being built. They kept being shipped to the front, tearing up rail lines and road surfaces. They kept achieving impressive tactical results in the shrinking number of circumstances where they could actually be employed. And they kept contributing to Germany's defeat, not through failure, but through success that came at unsustainable cost. Individual crews and commanders understood this at ground level. Reports from late war units show a grim pragmatism about what King Tigers could and couldn't do. Experienced officers stopped trying to use them for mobile operations and instead positioned them as mobile fortifications, heavy fire support for defensive positions where their mobility limitations were less critical. Some commanders requested that King Tigers be replaced with more numerous lighter tanks, reasoning correctly that 3 medium tanks that could actually maneuver were worth more than 1 heavy tank that couldn't. These requests were generally denied. The prestige of commanding King Tigers, the propaganda value, the institutional momentum, all worked against admitting the program was counterproductive. The end came as it had to come. As fuel supplies collapsed entirely in early 1945, most surviving King Tigers were simply abandoned. Crews trained extensively on these mechanical marvels ended up fighting as infantry or fleeing as refugees because their tanks couldn't move. Of the 492 produced, perhaps 10 survive today in museums, mechanical fossils of a military doctrine that prioritized theoretical excellence over practical effectiveness. The post-war analysis by both German and Allied military historians is remarkably consistent. The King Tiger was technically impressive and strategically disastrous. It represents the terminal stage of a design philosophy that had stopped asking whether weapons served strategic objectives and started treating technical superiority as an end in itself. This wasn't unique to Germany. Every military struggles with the temptation to build the best rather than the good enough. But Germany, resource-starved and fighting a multi-front war it was losing, could not afford the luxury of perfection. What makes this story more than just a footnote about tank development is what it reveals about how smart people convince themselves of counterproductive things. The King Tiger made sense at every level of analysis except the one that mattered. Made sense on the test range, made sense in technical specifications, made sense in isolated combat actions, made sense to engineers proud of their design, made sense to crews who survived battles they would have died in with lesser vehicles, made sense to propagandists who needed symbols of German might. It only stopped making sense when you asked the strategic question, is this helping us win the war? And that question, the only question that actually mattered, was the one the system was least equipped to ask honestly, because answering it honestly meant confronting the reality that Germany was losing, that no amount of technical sophistication could compensate for being outnumbered and outproduced, that the war would be decided by logistics and industrial capacity, not by which side fielded the better tank. The officers who climbed out of immobilized King Tigers in the spring of 1945, who watched them being blown up to prevent capture, who walked past columns of abandoned vehicles that had run out of fuel or broken down beyond repair, they understood. In the particular clarity that comes from watching grand strategies collapse into mud and mechanical failure, they understood that excellence without sustainability is just another form of failure. That building the best weapon is meaningless if you can't get it to the fight, can't keep it supplied, can't produce enough of them to matter. This is what the King Tiger reveals about military planning, about institutional decision-making, about the fatal gap between what impresses in theory and what works in practice. You can be right about everything except the thing that matters and still lose. You can build a weapon that wins every battle it fights and still contribute to losing the war. You can achieve technical perfection and strategic catastrophe simultaneously. The King Tiger wasn't defeated by Allied tanks. It was defeated by bridges that couldn't support it, roads that couldn't handle it, fuel supplies that couldn't sustain it, and an industrial system that couldn't produce it in meaningful numbers. It was defeated by the mathematics of logistics and the reality that wars are won by armies that can move, not by individual vehicles that can't. In the end, 68 tons of Krupp steel, the most powerful tank ever built, the weapon that was supposed to turn the tide, helped ensure that the tide kept flowing in exactly the direction Germany couldn't afford, not because it was bad, because it was too good, too heavy, too complex, too expensive, too perfect for a war that needed adequate, mobile, sustainable force projection, not isolated examples of engineering excellence. The crews who fought in King Tigers were brave. The engineers who designed them were brilliant. The tank itself was a masterpiece of its kind. But it was a masterpiece that helped lose a war, which means it was, in the only measure that matters, a failure. A failure that teaches us something crucial about the difference between capability and effectiveness, between technical achievement and strategic value, between building what sounds impressive and building what actually works. This is the lesson written in the wreckage of 492 abandoned tanks scattered across Europe. The best weapon is not always the best choice.